motivation was to wrap up what we had done on Quebec within Borders in Globalization, and mainly the three main ideas that our main findings we got after we went through those few years of research with Borders in Globalization, and under the direction of Emmanuel and the support, and I cannot state that enough, of Nicole. What was interesting from our point of view, and I will come directly, since we don't have much time and it's the end of the day, to the three main constats we've done about that border. First of all, and what really surprised us, is that we always thought that the US-Quebec border, since we were living so close, was widely studied and understood. And once we began searching about the US-Quebec border, we discovered that there was actually pretty much nothing. As if that part of the border was invisible. And it made sense in a sense because the geography of that border is not parallel. It turns around itself sometimes, it's a bit tricky, and it's also very much rural. So it's mainly villages, and when we speak about twin cities, here in Quebec we speak about twin village. It was also fairly small, so nobody had a great interest in that border. The fact is also that there has been a tradition, the border has always been seen in a positive way, whether legally or illegally. The border has been, people have been populating the borderlands on each side, and in a very insular way. We speak French, and which makes a double insularity in a way. And the people across the border used to speak French too, because most of them were Quebecois crossing the border, and you had kind of a spillover effect of the language. So there was the sense that, a sense of belonging in that borderland, and the border per se wasn't as perceived the same way, I think, in other places, and we didn't have the need to make ourselves different from the southern borders, the southern neighbors, because those Vermontois or New Hampshire felt very much more like us than the rest of Canada. And what was interesting is to see that those people, let's say in Burlington, are still watching Hockey Night on the Canadian networks because they relate much more to the Canadians than they relate, let's say, to the Avalanche of Colorado or what have you. So there is that sense of belonging to the same borderland. 9/11 has clearly induced a mutation of that vision of the border, and we've seen an increase in academic production around mainly security issues. So there has been an adjustment, and the people who wrote about that are clearly in that room. If we were to disappear in, I don't know, a meteorite, or bombings or any terrorist attack right now, the Quebec knowledge, the knowledge on the US-Quebec border would disappear with us, because all of you are here in the room. So that's about it. So yeah, Christian Leprecht, Victor Conrad, you've written on those matters, and you've touched on those matters. Alexandre Bellier was also around. So there are very few of us working on that, but it's mainly the security issue. What was interesting also is to see that the integration, the degree of integration of that trans-border community has led to a different understanding of the border. Queen Lily's brothel was built right on the borderline to benefit from the existence of the border. The Amtrak was it CN train railway was stopping, had an illegal stop to disembark Americans who wanted to go to that brothel on the border, and people were drinking on each side, and depending on which police was coming in, people would exit on the other side. So there always been that myth about the border that has changed with 9/11, following 9/11 and the fortification of the border. Hence, we have tried and we've adopted the method that Big was suggesting, which was to talk to stakeholders and go and talk to the private sector and see what were their concerns, because nobody had studied the border, or hardly anybody. I shouldn't say nobody, but clearly there were lots of gaps in those studies. And what was interesting is to see what came back. And the first thing that came back, weirdly enough, was language, and how truckers had a hard time crossing the border and establishing or being able just to work on the other side of the border because of language. What was interesting also is to see that in each, almost each border crossing on the American side, you actually had somebody who spoke French, but it's not mandatory. Border patrols need to go through Spanish courses, but not French. But clearly, they always have a supervisor that kind of understands, is from the area. So there is a way to deal with that on the US side, but it has never been, nothing has been done to facilitate the border crossing on that regard. But what we've seen is that there is clearly a need mentioned by congressmen, and that's the study developed by Frédéric Gagnon and Christophe Cloutier and Vincent Boucher. There is the need expressed by congressmen along the border to better assess the border, both in terms of security, but also in terms of cooperation. And that has been reinforced by the Lac Mégantic tragedy, where a train coming from the US with burnt oil killed actually almost half of a village in Quebec. And so there has been clearly the need to securitize the border, but not only on migration issues, but also on big commerce infrastructures. And we've also, in that process, talking to stakeholders, have had many talks with the aeronautic industry, aerospace industry, and they've been struggling, and Jeffrey knows a lot about that. They have been struggling with ITAR regulations that have had an impact, a tremendous impact actually on our industry, because we often talk about the car industry in Ontario, where a car crosses several times the border. Actually, it's the same on the Quebec side, where cockpits cross several times the border. So that has had an essential impact. So the research we've produced within that program, Borders and Globalization, I think has been l'apport. We've added definitely to academic research on the US-Canada border and in the border in general. We have seen that the border has thickened, but also hardened. The study by Andréane Bissonnette on how we have now checkpoints at the northern border in the US. So if we're going to the US, we will meet checkpoints as we do here on the southern side of the US. And this is something that is new. So there is really the hardening of the border. And at the same time, we've got the permanence of symbolic spaces, like the Haskell Library, which lies literally on the line in Stansted, and is still a place where, so you will enter from the US side, but the line, there is some black tape in the middle of the library that shows that you are either on the Canadian or the US side. And that that space has been used by draftees from Vietnam who were fleeing from the US. So they will be sitting on the Canadian side and their family would visit on the US side. And we see now that with Syrian families and Iranian families, where some of them have had visas on one side and some of them on the other side. So those spaces are very few, but they still exist, and I think that's necessary. And we've seen that some spaces that have had hardened with 9/11 had gone back to something somewhat closer to what it was pre-9/11, and maple syrup is one of the industry that has been affected by 9/11, where some small border crossing have been closed, but there has been some practices that have helped soften in a way what had been done after 9/11, and that is the study that has been developed by Talia d'Aragon-Gier. So what we came up with in the wrap-up chapter was that the US-Quebec border has come outside of the anecdotal. That's it. Sphere, and is now more in the light of academic research. And I think it was more than necessary, and we are still in kind of a gray zone where it is hardened, it is thickened, but to a certain extent. And I think there is more work to be done, Emmanuel, so we definitely need to further that research in maybe another version of Borders in Globalization.